Hey everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. Our today's topic is no CVE required, and we're going to talk about the settings that attackers use instead of exploits, why they do that, and what MSPs can do to remediate those and do so profitably. Um, Probably last about 30 to 40-ish minutes, and we'll do some Q&A towards the end. So please feel free to jump in with any questions throughout the presentation. So just to start things off, no CVE required. Now that's a really interesting title. ThreatMate has been talking about vulnerability management and pen testing, etc. for years now. That's why this title is really interesting. So it's no CVE required. Now, what we mean by that is, from an attacker's perspective, they just want to get access to the crown jewels. Now, the crown jewels can be anywhere, whether it's on laptops, servers, in the cloud. Ultimately, it's just data that an attacker can find valuable. Maybe they want to steal it and resell it or manipulate it. But ultimately, crown jewels are that's the end goal. Now, how do they get there? Variety of ways. As we know, as you look at attack surfaces, it ranges from external to internal, and in cloud, and you can look at vulnerabilities and info stealers. There's a bunch of ways in, but at the end of the day, the attackers that are going after SMB are relatively lazy, right? They're playing a numbers game. They're going after a bunch of different companies, and they're trying to get access to the crown jewels as cheaply and as quickly and as easily as possible. So I think the industry has done a phenomenal job at catching up on the vulnerability side of things over the last couple of years. I think the MSP world, the world has really embraced this, and leveraging the patch management solutions and vulnerability management solutions to really close that gap. And I think that's been a huge impact in helping the SMBs that we ultimately serve. But what we're going to talk about today is weak configurations, because weak configurations is such an easy way to get into an environment. From an attacker's perspective, there's minimal friction. It's just leveraging stuff that's already there, as long as you know where to look. So this represents a huge opportunity for the MSP space, but also from an attacker's perspective, there's a lot of opportunity here as well. So just to double click on that a little bit more, the traditional question around patching, it really answers the question, is the software out of date? Software generally has bugs or issues. Those result in vulnerabilities and ways to get into an environment. Hardening, which is what we're going to talk about today, hardening of configurations, asks a different question. It's asking, is the machine configured the way that it should be? Now, it should be is going to be a relative term. There's going to be various ways to answer that question. That's what we'll focus on today. But an open configuration or an untouched configuration or a weak setting is ultimately like leaving the front door completely unlocked. If you walk up to it and you know what to do, you pretty easily get in. Now, a couple of numbers that really make this case is first, this dates back a couple of years back in 2022. Microsoft published a document or a study saying that 80% of ransomware attacks could be traced back to common configuration errors. 80%. That's crazy. Now, that's a few years old. So in taking a look at a more recent study that Verizon published, and their documents are fantastic on this. If you haven't read any of the Verizon guides, lots of great data in them. What they've recently published is saying that 4 out of 5 breaches start somewhere other than an unpatched vulnerability. So what this is saying is patching done completely perfectly still only covers a fifth of the ways that attackers can get into a network. So these two different things, despite a couple of years apart, are really saying the same thing. And I think that is really telling that around the opportunity around configuration hardening. Over 3 big years in cybersecurity, we're still seeing the same ratio, roughly speaking, of attacks that are started by configuration errors. So there's a massive opportunity here. And before we jump into the product side and the solution, I do want to mention some data that we've collected. So we've just recently launched a configuration hardening solution in the part of the ThreatMate platform that we'll show in just a moment. But the data that we've already gotten back from our free preview is very, very telling, and it tells pretty much the same story as we just said. We've checked about 50,000 Windows 11 machines within our customer base, and all anonymized. And we've checked about 456 various configuration checks. That number might seem high, but it's actually based off of several industry benchmarks, CIS and otherwise. So there's a lot of really important checks that have to be done to make sure that Windows is configured in a strict way. What we did find, which is terrifying, is that only 1 in 313 machines scored 70% or better. So out of all the controls and checks that we checked, so we score them pretty simply based off of that. Only 1 out of 313 scored well, which is terrifying. So if you actually extrapolate the math on that, that was a couple of hundred devices out of 50,000 machines were configured in a good way. 70% is not great, but it's good. And if you look at it even further than that, the average score across 50,000 machines was actually about 40%, which is absolutely terrifying. And now it's important to note that though this isn't 50,000 different problems, it's actually a really short list of protections over and over and over again. And this is where there's a huge opportunity in the MSP space for automation and being able to leverage tools like ours to be able to remedy these situations and do so profitably. Now just further than that, let's dive into a couple of specific examples based off of that data, taking a look at some of the top ways that the attackers actually get in and spread across the network. 6 of them are open on almost every machine. And you can kind of take a look through this list here. Again, this is 6 out of 400 something controls, but some good examples here. So in 99.2%, nearly 100. Ransomware is able to reboot the PC into safe mode where the EDR or antivirus is not running. Very, very simple thing to prevent, but it's not configured in most scenarios. Similarly speaking, hardening UNC paths, fairly technical term there, but what that means is a rogue file server can hand PC code to just run, and it just will run it. No one has to do anything more than that. 99.1% of machines are vulnerable to that configuration. Passwords lifted right out of memory is another fairly common one. 98.4% of machines are open to that particular or lacking hardening for that particular configuration. And an even scarier one is allowing NTLM and legacy authentication methods that is enabled on 86.7% of machines. Could go on, but these are very, very scary stats. But also proves there's a massive opportunity here for us to help out in these scenarios. And especially as you start chaining these things together, it gets even more scary. Someone opens up an attachment, nothing looks wrong. That document just in the background starts running a second program. We've all seen this and heard of this before. And there's a rule in Windows that actually can help block that exact type of situation. But as we just mentioned, it's off in most scenarios. Now, from there, that machine can then read saved logins right from the PC's memory, not cracked or guessed or anything, just read. Again, that protection was just never switched on by default. And then once they've gotten that credential, they're effectively now staff. And now they can just walk the network machine to machine using these logins that just worked, because nothing on the network then asks them to prove who they are. And if they are prompted, legacy authentication protocols allow another way to just traverse that network. So this is just a story around you don't need a CVE or a vulnerability or a missing patch or anything to be able to do this. This is just chaining together a couple of very simple configurations but have a very, very scary outcome where an attacker can just get in and start cruising through the network. And that as you relate that back to the stats we just showed, this is open on so many environments. So what we've done is we're introducing a endpoint config hardening solution. Now, just to start out, this will be in a read-only mode. This is just going to be assessing and reporting on configuration. We'll talk about roadmaps shortly. But starting today, we are able to now score and look at all of the different configurations across Windows 11 machines across all of your customers. And this is free in preview for the next 30 days, leading up to September 18th, in which it'll then be included in our Armor tier. So how it works fairly quickly is leveraging the agent that is already deployed. We will run all the applicable checks on that machine. And bring them all back and then score them to make sure against various industry benchmarks. Now, so this is the first view. This takes a look at the entire customer or all of your customers together. We can roll up scores and largely let you know kind of where the biggest gaps are. It's rated by impact, and it's ultimately just trying to bring all this context together. So this is really a quick scoring view across all of your customers. But where the nerd in me gets really excited is these controls. We've offered a bunch of information about them, so it's not just it passed or it failed. If you jump into any particular control, you can see what we were expecting to see to pass that control, and what we did see. So you can kind of see expected versus found. You can see all the raw commands that are completely copy and pastable to either fix, to verify, or to roll back if you ever need to. And as a part of this, I think this is my favorite part, is we've also done an assessment of the user impact of making some of these changes. And in most cases, there's near zero or zero user impact. But it does flag it right there and then as to telling you what the risk of a user impact is. And then it shows you all the context to be able to again run those steps, verify it, and then roll back if needed. And it'll also show you what it counts as evidence for. And we'll talk about various compliance frameworks in a moment. But the best part about these about the endpoint controls and endpoint config hardening is almost all these different frameworks that are out there actually look at very similar things under the hood. So we'll talk about that shortly. And then last but not least, in the beta version is offering exports that auditors and otherwise are looking for. So we export the raw detail, so it is per device, per control, in a format that auditors can import into their own system, and we'll bring all that information all into this particular export. And then before we jump into roadmap, one of the most important things about how scoring works on compliance is kind of the default or empty state. So say we're able to go and query a device and check to see if something's configured properly. If we can tell it's configured properly, awesome, great. Then it's a passing grade. If we can confirm that it is not configured properly, okay, that's a failing grade, and that counts towards the score. The bigger question then is, what about if nothing's set? So unset is kind of the bigger question as to how do machines get scored. So what we do is we've evaluated each of these different controls and states to figure out what the default should be. A default safe means that if nothing is configured, the assumption is that you're in good shape. But most of them actually default to unsafe, meaning that if something's not configured, it's likely a failure. So things like if you're looking at like the Windows firewall, that one's pretty straightforward. It's on or off, and then you can kind of get into other details and rules. But other things like like BitLocker encryption, on and off is a binary state, but how it's encrypted is not. So that's where we can check these things against more definitive states. But in the event where where in the event where we need to default, we will typically default to unsafe, and we'll tell you those scenarios. And then the last one is, so I guess another one is inconclusive. That's generally where a software is just not installed or it's just not applicable. So we'll generally exclude that. And then last but not least is an acknowledged state. You can accept any of these particular gaps, whether it's it's something that the end user can't or doesn't want to change. Documenting it in the product allows us to acknowledge the risk and then track it from there. On the roadmap side of things, and so very, very soon, probably later this week, we'll be allowing this on or enabling this on Windows servers as well. So not just Windows 11 devices, but also be going on Windows servers. We'll also be adding some 3 or 4 really great reports that are framework driven. So those will be coming hopefully later this week or early next week. And in these reports, you'll pick the framework that you have to attest to, and then it'll explain how you're scoring against it, some of the actions that are required, and then being able to resolve it from there. And then last but not least, coming later this year will be auto remediation. So this will be applying a fix from the dashboard, and then looking into things like managing drift and etc. So those are coming a little bit later, but on the roadmap. Before we leave kind of the technical side of the house, I want to talk a little bit about operationalization of these types of features. Now, this is a prime type of feature or issue or problem, I should say, that is the perfect solution, the perfect type of problem for automation. That's what I was trying to say. So from a configuration perspective, this is ultimately just changing a setting on Windows, whether it's through group policy, a local policy, a registry setting, or otherwise. So this is a prime situation to leverage automation. Now, just because you can automate it, this doesn't mean you can and should in all cases. This kind of goes back to the user impact risk that I was talking about earlier. About 86% of the things we check ultimately have, let's call it, a low or no risk to affecting the end user. Mediums, there's about 13 of them. It could affect the end user if they're in some situations. So in terms of a rollout, I would definitely suggest fixing all of the low risk ones, today or as soon as possible. Those are very, very, very easy changes, and then low risk, meaning in this context, low risk of impacting the user, not low risk that attackers will take advantage of it. So we do have the 2 different dimensions presented, so you can easily prioritize by, the risk to the computer is high and the risk to the user is low. Those are the perfect ones to automate immediately because they're the biggest bangs for your buck. And then mediums, often you can test it out on a device or 2, verify it, wait a day or so just to make sure, but largely those are pretty easy. And then under 1% of them, I would suggest actually like a real group of users to test them out, just to make sure there's no compatibility issues or user effect or anything that affects like their day-to-day workflow. That can happen in under 1% of the controls, so they're important to do, but definitely I would test them out a little bit further. And that's how I would suggest kind of operationalizing some of these. And then furthermore, one of the things that we'll also to keep track of is regression. So we'll also let you know if a setting was changed and it regressed back to a previous state. We'll clearly show you that as well in the exports and in the reports, so you can easily see whether a setting has gone backwards. All right, now let's talk about the money side of things. So I think this is one of my favorite types of opportunities for the MSP space because there is a huge opportunity to offer a service around this, and most people are tying this back to a compliance requirement or insurance requirements. At the end of the day, it's all about securing your customers, but getting them to pay for it is always the tricky part. So that's where this is a great one because it ties back to compliance and insurance. So this is this is a good example. Now, if you ever get the insurance renewal questionnaires or anything handed to you, I'm sure you've seen this before, where there's a statement of saying like, describe how your workstations are configurations are hardened, and provide some evidence. I think everyone I've talked to has seen that at least once, or if not all the time. And it is a really tricky question to answer without a product or a tool like ours. So this is really where the money comes in, because your customers are seeing this in their insurance renewal for questionnaires. So this is kind of the perfect scenario. And furthermore, from a technical perspective and a compliance perspective, this is really a configure once and report to all of them type scenario, meaning that whether you're looking at the big baselines like CIS or NIST or etc., or you're looking at sector specific ones, so PCI and HIPAA, SOC 2, CMMC, or even some of the more national ones like the Essential 8 in Australia, CAN 104 in Canada, Cyber Essentials in the UK. Ultimately, these are all different names, but nearly the same technical controls under the hood. So it's going to be different auditors, different language, but from an implementation perspective, it's often the same setting. So largely what that means is if you solve it once, you actually can get credit for a number of different compliances. And that's where some of our reporting will really come in. You can tell us what frameworks you have to attest to, and we'll show you which settings we can change, we can tell you about, and then in the future change, that will then solve for attestment on various different compliance frameworks. Out of the box, we're going to be supporting 8 different compliance frameworks, which covers a lot of the various national, sector, and baselines. And then again, it's harden it once, and you get evidence for all of them, which is the best case for automation. But going back to the business opportunity, a lot of MSPs are offering this as a compliance as a service. And when I say a lot, let's put some numbers behind that. Our friends at ScalePad actually did a survey a couple months ago, I think it was, and it came back saying that only 36% of MSPs are formally offering compliance services, whether it's compliance as a service or otherwise. Um, and most of them are projecting massive growth as a result of it. So let that sink in for a second. We've talked about the opportunity. We've talked about the technical solution being a great like prime for automation and prime for this market. And we've also talked about how it's being asked about almost anywhere and everywhere, but only a third of the market is actually doing it. This is a great opportunity. This is your call to action to take a look into this if you haven't already. 2/3 of the market have not started a practice on this. So this is a great opportunity. And just to add to that, from an implementation perspective, so we've talked about the demand. The demand exists, right? Insurance renewals are happening, vendor reviews, CMMC, etc. Your clients are already being asked, whether they know it or not, for a service exactly like this. But even better than that, this fits the team you already have. There's no additional specialization or knowledge or context that the team needs to have. And even from a technology perspective, this is already on the agent that you already have. And this is prime for your team as well, right? They understand Windows, they understand group policy, they understand how these things work together. They've been working on this for years, but packaging it up to be compliance as a service is the big movement here, because the market and others are demanding for this information. And at the end of the day, the deliverable is real. It's a hard file. It's an evidence file. It's a trend. Again, they might not appreciate the technical aspects behind it, but they know that they need it. So this is absolutely a great opportunity, and I hope everyone walks away from this call. If they haven't already started looking at compliance as a service, take a look at it. It's the perfect opportunity for the MSP space. And from an offering perspective, it kind of fits the existing model that all MSPs already generally do. Step one is a posture assessment, largely known as a network assessment in other scenarios. And then, the recurring line item is, the monthly hardening. making sure that the gaps are closed according to your roadmap. Drift is caught and is addressed. And then quarterly, you deliver the status update and the evidence file as requested. This kind of fits exactly the same model that the MSP world has been doing for 20 years or so, just on a new topic and a topic that our technicians are well versed in. So from a pricing perspective, again, very similar to almost everything else the MSP market's been doing for the last 20 years, is there's really three ways to do it. Folded into a top tier, so there's no SKU, no new line items. It just becomes part of your premium tier. Helps you drag up upgrades to that tier. You can price it per endpoint, which is one of them, actually not one of the most common way that we're seeing MSPs do it right now is doing it this way. So they're pricing it per endpoint per month. It gets its own line item on the invoice, and then in the quarterly deliverable of the evidence file, in addition to kind of a QBR style update. And then last but not least is an assessment led, which can be converted if they do convert to your recurring services. So again, very, very similar model to everything else we've been doing for the last many years. The key here, though, is don't position this as a scan. That kind of devalues it significantly. Position it as the outcome, which is being able to immediately answer their insurance questionnaires, being able to immediately provide that information to their auditors, etc. That goes a long way to establishing the credibility, that you are doing your job and you've done these things that they need you to do, and you have the evidence handy. It's not they ask for it and you'll get back to them in a couple of weeks. You've got it handy. You know what you're doing. And last but not least, and this is a great opportunity for this group to go out and shine. Not everyone's doing this, as we just talked about. Only a third of the MSPs out there are doing this, and not even on every client. So there's a big opportunity for you to stand out in the market and make a bunch of money while you're at it. And this is a great opportunity to differentiate yourself from many of the other MSPs if you get on this train early. And before we wrap up, there's ultimately 5 moments in which this just sells itself. The insurance renewal, as I mentioned, that is a thing that most people have to go through nowadays. So if you can kind of put like a calendar invite to yourself, a couple of weeks or 6 weeks out before the renewal, you look like a hero with that evidence file ready for their sign off, ready to go. The framework letter lands, meaning that they have to attest to either a review, SOC 2 review or HIPAA date or otherwise. You generally know when those dates are, and that is a great opportunity to sell them compliance as a service at that date. New client onboarding, again, I bake this assessment into every single customer's onboarding, because just like vulnerabilities, this is a way to get into a network very easily. So establishing a baseline on day one and the service in the first agreement makes it a great and easy sell. But also, again, lets you know what you're getting into before you're walking into an environment. QBR is obviously another great opportunity to sell this. And then prospecting with an incumbent. So, we've talked about, only a third of the market is even, doing this on a regular basis. That is a huge opportunity for you to go in and do an assessment on other prospects, and then show them the data, and never make this a this or them, and go and attacking their existing service provider. The data will speak for itself, right? And ultimately, if this is a good opportunity to show them the report, show them where they're at, and let them ask the hard questions. So that's a great opportunity, and it's a great conversation starter for each of these different types of moments where compliance as a service is again ripe for this opportunity. So on the product side, this is in free preview for all customers until December 18th, after which this will be available only to customers in the Armor tier. So this gives everyone on the call a month to score all the existing customers you have in the ThreatMate platform, and the evidence is ready to go, and ready to export. So feel free to play around with this. We would love to hear your feedback, any questions or comments or anything you'd love. Again, this is a great opportunity for us to disrupt this space, but also improving the SMB landscape as a whole while we do it, right? If we can make a dent in that 80% number that we shared at the beginning of this call, that has been 80% for the last couple of years, let's get that down. Let's aim to reduce that number over the next year. I'd love to see it at 0, but hey, let's even if we can get it down to 60, that is a big win for the SMB space, where a simple hardening of configuration can really save them that whole headache of getting attacked. So we'll go ahead and end it there. Hopefully, I think it was actually pretty much spot on in 30-ish minutes. Feel free to ask any questions. Book a demo if you're not already a ThreatMate customer at threatmate.com. I'm happy to answer any questions. My email address is just patrick@threatmate.com. Love to hear your thoughts, requests, and we're here for that. Thanks everyone. Thanks for your patience and thanks for your time today.